Welcome to our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to our national conversation. The date today is February 22nd. Once again, fairly early in the morning. It's about 7 a.m. here for me, which is why my lighting is pretty bad. It's still dark in Utah at this time, at least semi-dark anyway. I'm joined today by Eric, one of our two kind of rotating guests here. We love to have both you and Tanya on. Eric, what are we going to be talking about today primarily?
Yeah, good to be with you, Sam, as always. Yeah, I think DOGE, there's been so much happening and I think, it really cuts to the heart of a lot of modern political debates. So I think we could probably trend in that direction for sure, the
Mhm.
Muskites and whatnot.
Yeah, awesome. Now, before we get into that, I realized, I really briefly introduced you guys. I really briefly introduced myself. I almost said myselves. But that's, I don't know, maybe kind of an impoverished sort of introduction, just saying, hey, this is Eric. He's a policy writer with ONC. Just so anyone who's watching this kind of has a better understanding of who you are, then I'll follow this up as well. Do you mind providing just like 15-second intro? This is Eric. This is why I like policy. This is what I've done with it, etc.
Sure. My name's Eric McKelvin. I'm from Slidell, Louisiana, which is, if you know anything about New Orleans geography, it's right above the lake. And I got involved, in policy when COVID hit. I think like a lot of kids, I was a junior in high school and couldn't really understand how the policy sausage was being made. I was quite
Mm-hmm.
frustrated at times with how it was being enacted. And when I went to college, all those views just continued to grow and expand. So that's really where I think I got my leaping point.
Awesome. And did you study something like political science, or was policy kind of off to the side?
Yeah, I majored in political science with a minor in history. So yeah,
Awesome.
history was, it's been a love of mine, for a long
Mhm.
time.
Awesome. Really, really cool. So, just to provide a little more thorough intro to me, then we'll get into the discussion. I well, I graduated from BYU, also with a degree in political science. Though I got one of my minors was in philosophy. That was kind of my like supplement to political science. I was the philosophy element, kind of the counterpart to what I presume what you did with
The
history there.
theory guy, yeah.
Oh yeah, I love political theory. Love that. Um, but yeah, I've been really interested in public policy since I became very involved with speech and debate in high school. That was a really big thing. Speech and debate and theater; those two they were awesome. But I was mentioning this to Tanya last episode. I started out, which is kind of funny because I take a progressive view on a lot of issues now. I started out as just a massive Ben Shapiro junkie. Like that was my thing. Like, oh, that guy's so cool. Yeah, look at him own the liberals,
Yeah,
etc. And now I'm generally speaking, especially on social issues, a liberal. So it's just kind of funny.
that
Um,
is interesting. That is definitely interesting.
yeah, yeah. Do I strike you as kind of the Ben Shapiro fanboy? At least that's my origin, or
No, I listen to Ben's show occasionally, so
yeah.
I'm not gonna overly criticize Shapiro.
Oh yeah.
I do think he is somewhat of an acquired taste. There's no doubt about that. But yeah, I think growing and changing with your political views is a sign that you're thinking. So it's never a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into the conversation then. That's enough about us. So, Doge itself. Now we kind of off screen we started talking about this a little bit, and we do have maybe some somewhat divergent views on Doge, or at least kind of what elements of it are concerning or justified, etc. So we can really get into that. I just, as a full disclosure, do find Doge quite concerning. I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's a coup of billionaires, etc., or it's an oligarchy. I don't know if I'm quite as far as Bernie, though he did deliver a pretty powerful speech. I would say, though, that Doge, in my view, is concerning for three particular reasons, and we can kind of dig into your thoughts on each of these, and we can see, if you're reading something else from the evidence here. Um, so the first thing would be, I do find it concerning that we're changing a lot of kind of these career appointments throughout a lot of these executive agencies to political ones. So chief info officers, other people who've been in there for years. It's just okay. Let's get rid of them. Let's put in someone who's a close associate of Musk or Trump. Maybe they have some relevant expertise, but as someone who values consistency in the operations of agencies, consistency in kind of maintaining policy, this is a little concerning to me. I don't want to have a situation where the executive branch is changed dramatically every time we have a new president. I on the spectrum of let's shift things around to let's kind of maintain things. Let's maintain the security of this. Let's maintain consistent policy. I'm more on that latter end of the spectrum. The other two elements are just that Doge itself, in moving so quickly, is fairly non-transparent. So we can get into that a little bit and the issues surrounding that. And the final thing that and once again, I don't really want to traffic into conspiracy theories here, but it's just something that does concern me. Is with Musk being a special government employee, still very much involved in the private sector, a lot of other people that he's putting into these positions are heavily involved with the private sector or have been thoroughly involved with it in very high echelons, we might say. And there's the whole debacle around access to sensitive financial information in the Treasury, all sorts of stuff there. So we can get into each of those and whether maybe I've been reading too much CNN. I'm very curious what your thoughts are here, but yeah, let's just kind of start with you. Do you find Doge concerning? Would you say that it's a constitutional crisis, as many people are saying? Like what's your appraisal of the situation?
Yeah, well, this is always one of the fun thing about politics, right? Because you can look at the same issue from two different lenses and come away with a different vision of what exactly is happening.
Hmm.
But I do think there are radical changes going on in the federal government and how the federal and really executive branch is operating. I think a lot of these ideas of civil servants and, a third party to the government coming in and making policy is something that really began in like the 1920s with the technocrats of the day. And the general theory behind technocracy was, like you said, normal civilian appointments that might just be given, for political reasons may not have the expertise to do what is needed. So within the executive branch, which executes the laws, there should be this, class of almost elite thinkers that are specialized in what they do
Mhm.
and can then group together and almost in a semi-secretive way, but not totally, come together and make policy. Upon hearing that, I think a lot of Americans would probably have a guttural reaction to that, because I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of anti-elitism in this country.
Mhm.
Some of that may be misplaced, but I think, the trend has been for a long time, 100 plus years, that the executive branch, assumes powers that was once delegated to Congress, um, and grows and grows and grows. And I think some of this is almost a personal thing for Trump because I think he feels as though the quote unquote deep state, those some of those career DOJ officials really went after him unfairly, and I think
Mhm.
a lot of those charges were specious. But I think the shift that we're seeing, it's not a bad thing, to have concerns. I certainly do have some concerns because, like you said, they're moving very quickly, and they're not just cutting fat; they could be cutting some muscle and bone. But that being said, I don't think it's a constitutional crisis because I think the way that the Constitution is laid out gives a lot of this power to the president. Are you familiar with Chevron deference?
Chevron deference. No, I am not. Educate me.
Sure. So this was a court case that happened 2 or 3 years ago, and Chevron deference was the precedent that an executive agency had wide control over its bylaws, and that it
Mm.
didn't need to seek congressional approval for all of the bylaws and ways that it was operating. That was reversed 2 or 3 years ago. And a lot of people thought it would have this massive effect, and it didn't really, because government goes on as it always has. But I
Mm.
think the Supreme Court has kind of been signaling that no, the executive does have, the executive being the president, does have more power over the agencies over which he presides. So I think some of this is inevitable. But look, Doge is moving a little too fast for me as well, and I think there could be more transparency. Not that there's ever been that much transparency within the executive branch, to be frank with
Mm.
you.
Mm.
But just to give an example of one thing that concerns me is I've heard that they want to cut the DoD budget 8% year over year. That is a lot. I mean, if they were able to do that for 4 years, we're talking billions and billions of dollars cut. Maybe some conservatives are right that the Raytheons of this world are dinosaurs and they're fat and happy and they're not innovating anymore, and we need to shake it up. And that could all well be true, but I think going in with that much of a broad meat hammer, as Chuck Schumer put it, that could be dangerous. Um, and I think one more important thing to note here is this is kind of the corporate mentality. It's almost the reverse of that technocratic side, which is Elon, when he bought Twitter and when he bought other companies, comes in, cuts the labor force, cuts it really hard, and then kind of allows it to regenerate in a way that can kind of gel. Kevin O'Leary, aka Mr. Wonderful, a guy who has been on Shark Tank, goes on the news a lot,
Mhm.
talked about this, and really what was kind of a funny rant about barbecue chicken and fat. It was very odd.
Uh-huh.
But the general premise was, you need to cut hard and it will return stronger. Now, I think the general premise of that is a good idea, but like you said, when we're talking about government, you know, that 8% DOD, there's some things that I think you could cut too hard in unnecessary ways. But I don't think it's a constitutional crisis. I think the president has almost unilateral power over these appointments as set aside by the Constitution. And I think this is a reassertion of
Mm.
that.
Yeah. So when people say this is, exercising far too much power over spending, like Congress has the power of the purse, they appropriate funds, but now the executive branch is, you know, firing tons of employees, which technically the money's still appropriated to those, those agencies, et cetera. So even if they cut it, it doesn't instantly reduce spending. Congress has to revise the appropriation, or we have to change that next time they take a look at it, which is presumably what will happen. But in your view, that's not like an overstepping of executive authority.
No, and I think maybe you could blame this as one of the flaws of democracy, and I think one of the reasons that we have such a large executive branch is because it was too much turnover. It
Mm.
was too much from president to president.
Mm.
With these radical shifts in the way that government was projecting its power, really to the foreign policy side, which is what I think
Mm.
people don't want to see a foreign policy switch every 4 years, and
Mm.
now that we're seeing that, from Biden to Trump, it's creating massive changes, and the world kind of feels a
Mm.
little unstable at times. Especially with the Ukraine negotiations. I think that's you couldn't get two different sides of the coin. From Trump to
Mm.
Biden on these kind of things. But you talked about spending, and I kind of want to hit on that. So, have you heard of this $5,000 initiative to send checks back to every American on DOGE savings?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm concerned that first of all, based on what I'm reading, it would be very hard for Doge to cut, so thoroughly that it makes that goal and does give $5,000 to every tax-paying American household, et cetera. I mean, a very small portion of the federal budget is allocated to the salaries of federal employees. Most of it is put into these massive welfare programs and other services, which, it would. I mean, they want to cut those dramatically, but I mean, we'll see how far they get there. And the other element, I've heard concerns that this would, if they actually did something like this, it could just contribute further to inflation, et cetera. Obviously, none of this money would be going to the deficit. Someone said, I believe it was, I can't remember exactly who. It was someone in one of these executive agencies who was defending Trump's comments here, who basically said, if we give Americans like $5,000, per tax-paying household here, that'll incentivize them to look for other areas of wasteful government spending. So really, it'll pay out in the end.
Mhm.
But I mean, are Americans not incentivized by, tax breaks by reducing spending anyway? I
Right.
I don't know how effective that would be, and I'd want to put that money towards reducing the deficit personally. But
I
that's what
agree.
I've heard about it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I've heard the number tossed around that 20% of Doge savings would go towards the deficit, and
Mm,
another 20 or more would go to this initiative. But I also did see a government official talking about this, and I thought it was kind of humorous because he talked about, the fact that, well, if you were to send $5,000 to Americans, they would probably largely save a lot of that. And I was like, I don't think that's how that works.
yeah.
I'm not an expert on any of these things, but I think it's clearly an inflationary policy, which is where
Mhm,
I kind of push back on that. Um, and so I think, with things like that, we could certainly use more transparency.
mm,
I heard that, Doge had this savings counter and that there was an error because they earmarked millions instead, or they earmarked it as billions instead of millions in some cases. And it's like,
mm,
that's concerning. We should
yep.
have a little more transparency there. But, continuing on that line of thought, I think some of this transparency issues has been, really unveiled with kind of the destruction of USAID. They
Mhm.
were doing a lot of things behind the scene. I don't know if you're familiar with Mike Benz. He's been going on somewhat of a revenge tour.
I've heard the
Um,
name thrown around a lot.
yes, yes. So he's very popular in conservative circles right now. I'll tell you that much. So he worked within the executive branch. I believe he worked for the FBI. Um, and he's dedicated. At least says he's dedicated the last few years of his life to looking into USAID, and these other NGO foundations that he describes as the long arm of the CIA. He puts a lot of the 2014 Maidan coup. He thinks a lot of that was USAID, Victoria Nuland. I don't know how much of it is true, but I think it's certainly true that what USAID was doing was really kind of a public front for some other nefarious things. And the listeners can go look into that if they want to look into Zunzania and look up Mike Ben's USAID. I certainly don't have time to get to all the things that he talks about. But a lack of transparency problem has been endemic, I think, in Washington. And I
Not
think
not
that
new with Doge.
yes, yeah, and but I think Doge could capitalize on that because Elon Musk says he's the most transparent person in the world. Look at how much I'm tweeting, right? Um, right, exactly. But I think if they really were serious about that, I think they could take some real steps to do that, and I hope
Mhm.
that they do.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be nice. That would be nice. If Doge could actually be a force for increasing federal transparency, that would be fantastic. But, I'm just not seeing that right now. And
Agreed.
due to how speedily Doge is acting, I mean, it's very difficult, kind of as I think we hinted there, to maintain thorough updates on what's going on, on all these cuts, etc. If you're just posting to X, if you're just saying like, hey, we have kind of the feed, here's what we're doing, huge savings here, great job everyone, and you're not really going into detail on, okay, here's exactly why we're cutting this, here's the analysis that went into it, here's who we're putting into this position, here's why. And I suppose the federal government hasn't, with a lot of these agencies, hasn't done that, hasn't made all that information publicly available. A lot of it, I guess a lot of it, frankly, the public just hasn't really been too interested in, for the most part. But I think when we're getting into these massive cuts, and as you said, kind of cleaving, not just fat but bone and muscle here, I think the transparency becomes even more of an issue, and I think Doge takes on even more of a responsibility to be transparent than maybe what we've generally seen from the federal government. But as a general rule, I do think transparency is the way to go. So I don't know. We'll see what the future holds. Maybe Doge just kind of does a 180 and starts going in that direction, which would be great. But yeah, we'll have to see. Let's get into a little bit here, and then maybe we can wrap up on Doge. And if we have time, maybe we can get into the Ukraine discussion a little bit. But it seems like we agree for the most part on a lot of elements of Doge here that we kind of find concerning. But the area where I think you're adding nuance to the perspective that I had, and maybe kind of introducing that alternative view, that I find interesting, is with these executive appointments and kind of the technocracy that exists in Washington and the federal government. So for anyone who's maybe not super appraised on the situation, um, Trump and Musk are kind of coming in and taking a lot of these positions that have been kind of these career appointments for a long time. So people who've been there across administrations, 20, 30 years, chief informational officers, others throughout these agencies, and just firing people, getting rid of people, and replacing them instead with political appointments. Oftentimes, people are associated with Musk or Trump, something like that. Now, as I said earlier, I was concerned that, okay, this is going to hamper the longevity of our policy. This is going to create issues. It's just expanding the degree to which the executive branch does like a flip flop or a 180 with every administration. It diminishes consistency, which in the foreign policy sphere especially, but also in the domestic sphere to a degree, it's that kind of flip flop creates discord. It reduces the degree to which America can have like a long term grand strategy, etc. So that's what I'm really concerned about, and I think you share some of those concerns. We've also said, Eric, with this technocracy that exists, maybe there is room to cut into it a little bit to, I guess, appease that guttural reaction that Americans tend to have when they hear, oh, there's all these like career bureaucrats in there, who exist administration to administration, and maybe they constitute a deep state, or maybe they are obstructing things. I think that the position one takes on this can largely be explained, even if not entirely explained, by this thing that comes up in political science a lot. That's like a trustee relationship with elected officials or a delegate relationship with them. I think this applies to Trump especially. So, if we treat Trump as more of a delegate, then it's like, okay, Trump should come in and, he should put people in that he said he would put in during the campaign trail, or hinted at putting in, I'm going to make this executive cabinet, etc. These are the kind of people I'm looking at. He should be very transparent about that going into things. He should make those appointments, and then, just kind of follow through on all of his promises that the American people elected him on. And, that's really it. The trustee position, though, would say Trump should get in there, and the American people put him in there because they trust him to do what he think would be best. And so he should, change things up. He should make all these additional appointments, really alter the executive branch in ways that, maybe he hinted at rhetorically, but he didn't lay out thoroughly. So I think that dichotomy plays into this position, this debate a lot. Like, whether you're really concerned about all of these political appointments being added. So, Eric, is there anything more you want to say about that? And like, would you say that you're maybe more in line with my position here on, I think this is really concerning. I want the consistency, or do you think there's quite a bit of validity to these concerns about the technocratic deep state, etc. And where do you stand on this delegate versus trustee? I'm just curious on maybe how you can broaden my perspective here.
Yeah, great question. And I think, I think the latter. I really am not that concerned about how the policy is really going to hit the road and change. But I think the trustee analogy, I think that's a good one, because when you have trustee rights, you almost have like semi ownership. That's not, you're not the owner, but you have a lot of purchasing power that the owner would have, and I think that is what more of the presidency is. And I think that's what a lot of representative government is. When we talk about a republic versus democracy, there's this annoying debate about what are we, what are we. In essence, we have aspects of both. But I do think, some of this has been a long time coming. I think, 92, when we talk about the D state, like 92% of DC voted blue. That seems a little bit, even the bluest cities in the country, that's a high number. And that makes you think, like, why are they doing that? And I think that's because, the people who are entrenched in these agencies are typically very blue. And I think if a president came in like Trump did in his first term and kind of allowed them to work underneath him and kind of cut him off at the feet. I mean, I don't know if you remember the Syrian issue where he was, launching missiles into Syria, and he was constantly looking for numbers and updates from his DOD, and they were actively feeding him bad information. So, I think that is something, you do that to a president once, and then he comes back. I don't think he's going to be very fond of you the next time he comes into office. And so I think some of this is personal for Trump. I think, the DOD investigations, I think a lot of those were specious charges. And I think he feels burned by it, because I think in his first term, he didn't really know, the extent to which kind of the sausage gets made, if you will, in Washington. And I think this is a real change in the way that government can be done. I think if Trump were to blow it, you could just as easily see a Democrat come in, rise in popularity and kind of rebuild that careerist kind of appointment model. And there certainly is room for those people because you do need experts, advising the federal government. So yeah, I don't think I'm overly concerned about, a constitutional crisis or that policy will shift radically because I think that's something that, almost needs to happen in this system. What's the point of putting someone in power if, the policy machine chugs along the same every 4 years? I think people voted for this. And I think that is, that's kind of jarring to a lot of people, but I really do think people voted for this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. I think there's valid points to be made on both sides here. And kind of going into this like, oh gosh, I just I really worry about these political appointments, etc. I really worry about the longevity of a U.S. grand strategy, and I still have those concerns. I really do, but I think you've presented another side here that I'm not seeing maybe in the kind of the general left wing, mainstream media, etc., or at least the way the media is treating this issue. I'm just kind of not really seeing that perspective. So thank you for sharing it.
Well, and likewise, sorry to cut you off, but I do think the transparency thing should be pushed really hard. Because
mm,
Musk has been given a lot of power, which has been, a fun talking point for the
mm,
CNN types. Musk, the co-president. I
mhm,
think that's a little overblown, by the way. But I think more transparency can solve a lot of issues in Washington, and I
mm,
think for the average voter sitting at home, they're not as involved, and if you were to project that information outwards about what's going on inwards within DC, I think a lot of us could come to the table and say this but not that, that but not this, and then we
mm.
could kind of move forward.
Yeah, yeah. So one other thing on this topic, and that's uh this kind of it's a much like broader thing, and I don't have research to really flesh this out, but my perception, especially based on this kind of talk about how the technocracy tends to be fairly blue for the most part, and we're kind of changing things up there, anyway, at least in Washington. I mean, most federal employees are elsewhere out there outside of Washington and other states, etc., so I don't know how they stack up in terms of partisanship, but like agency heads, et cetera, for a long time. Sure, it's fairly progressive, I suppose. And I'd imagine that's probably a result of a lot of these people, come from having very high degrees, come from academia, and then fill these federal positions, and naturally, you're going to get a much more progressive crowd. I listen to a lot of podcasts where you have these sorts of policy experts. Things like at least on foreign policy, like the Foreign Affairs interview, which I love. Fantastic podcast. But, it is obvious that generally speaking, unless you kind of have like a former Trump official coming in and talking about this, it's fairly progressive, what a lot of views offered are there, just because of the nature of the crowd. And now we're having a lot of people put in these positions who come from, very successful careers in the private sector. And that's a very different crowd, as just a general rule. So I am curious how this is going to shake things up in terms of, an ideological or partisan approach that's kind of underlying the normal functioning of an executive agency and kind of the assumptions that then go into that functioning as a result. Um, so with that, because we've started talking about foreign policy a little bit and we have some extra time, maybe like 5 to 10 minutes. I know 5 to 10 minutes to talk about Ukraine. That's going to
Yeah,
be
right.
it's going to be a difficult conversation here. So we'll try to fit in as much as we can, but let's just talk a little bit about this and some of the latest developments. Obviously, the United States and Russia have been talking. There's that negotiation that was started in Saudi Arabia. Ukraine wasn't really involved, and there's been lots of concerns. I know Bernie Sanders, said, "Hey, Trump is cozying up to Vladimir Putin because he wants authoritarianism to succeed." I don't quite know if I'd go that far. Once again, but it does seem to me that yes, Trump, at least in a transactional sense, is very much kind of like, okay, let's work with Putin here, let's come to a deal, etc. Let's get that implemented. And Ukraine, as Trump said, they've had the cards, etc. Or sorry, they don't really have any cards, and they've been in here trying to do things for like 3 years. You had 3 years to do something, didn't do anything, and so now we just have to take matters in our own hands. Let's work with Russia. Let's get a solution going. But there's a lot of people who point out Russia has engaged in ceasefires in the past. Going back to like the 2014 annexation of Crimea, etc. They've stopped fighting, and really they've just used this time to regroup, redeploy their military, mobilize assets, etc., resources, and then just get back into the fighting again. So if Trump does create some sort of ceasefire here, there's a widespread concern that it's really not going to do anything, and this isn't going to stop unless I guess Ukraine capitulates. Which, I mean, if that's true, then I don't know how much we could do even if Ukraine was at the table, in these sorts of negotiations. But yeah, I am concerned about, trying to create some sort of quick solution to this conflict that allows Russia to take a lot of the territory that it's gained. And, maybe Ukraine is really pressured into concessions like that. I don't see it making those sorts of concessions, but maybe something happens. Russia's in a more favorable position now, and like a year or two later, they reinitiate the invasion. And it didn't really do anything other than benefit Putin. So that's my concern. That's a lot of what I'm reading here.
Mhm.
I don't know. Do you have the same view of the situation? Is there something I'm missing?
So I think I can add, my own side, and I think there's 2 points here. And I think, the first thing, talking about Zelensky and Ukraine starting the war, I
Oh
don't
yeah.
think anyone wants to hear that,
Yep.
because I think it was categorically untrue. That's the first thing. But
Mhm.
I think that's a personal thing with Trump. I don't think he really likes Zelensky.
Mhm.
And Zelensky is, I think, is stuck between a rock and a hard place, and has been for 3 years, because Zelensky can't go back to his people and say, we've given up Crimea, we've given up the Donbass, we've given up these eastern regions of our country. But I think the situation on the ground is, and this is what I'm hearing a lot from like the JD Vances of the world, and that kind of policy institute currently in Washington, is that Russia is deeply dug in those areas. And
Mhm.
Crimea voted to join the Russian Federation in 2014. So
Mhm.
I
Although we,
do
we
think,
don't know like how legitimate those votes
correct,
were.
correct. And I do want to preface this because
Mhm.
I think there is heavy Russian support in these areas, but whenever we call in elections, I think, Russia's
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
there. But it's around 60% ethnically Russian. They speak
Mhm.
Russian, for the most
Mhm.
part. So I think that's one thing. I don't think I think Trump has been burned by Zelensky. For example, in the 2024 election cycle, Zelensky went to Pennsylvania with Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania and did kind of a
Mhm.
weapons manufacturing tour, and I think a lot of people rightly took that as kind of a show of support for the Democratic side of politics. But going back to his position, he can't do that. He can't go back to his people and say, we lost, we're giving this up. So he almost has to strong man it. And I think Trump is right to feel that he's going to have to cram a deal down on Zelensky. And that might actually be bailing him out. If he can go to his people and say, this was the deal, that the United States, who has essentially allowed us to continue to fund this war, is cramming down on us, and obviously we have Putin overbearing on us. We don't have much of a choice. And I think the second big thing that I want to impress on people is that, for wrong or for right, I don't think Trump is moralizing the situation. And we've seen him do this a lot with, dictators of the world, calling them nice names, calling them nice things. I don't think he's because he actually thinks they're buddy buddies. I don't think he sees it that way. I just think he doesn't take a moral view of what Putin did and who Zelensky is and who Ukraine is, because I think that goes back to kind of this America First mentality. And I don't really agree with that, but there is a large section of the right that says, I don't care if Putin strolls into Kyiv.
Mhm.
And I disagree with that strongly, but I think that's kind of where he's seeing this. And I think
Mhm.
that's where you get that deal that he tried to give Zelensky of, the minerals, the 50% deal going forward, and definitely the US would have, wide control over Ukraine's minerals. Um,
Mhm.
and I think this may, and I don't want to step too much into this because you never know what he's thinking. But if he can play hardball with the Ukrainians, the Europeans who had a emergency summit, after a
Mhm.
lot of this started breaking down, maybe they step into the void and give Ukraine the security clearances and deals that they've really been looking for.
Mm.
So maybe that's his play. But I think the situation on the ground, I think some of it is entrenched. I don't think, outside of using U.S. military personnel, fighter planes, I don't think they're going to get Crimea back, and I don't think a lot of the eastern regions are going anywhere.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people have died, on almost like the eastern front of World War One. Like, this isn't moving, and if it is moving, it's moving the wrong way. Putin is continuing to make very small incursions. So I think that those are two things that I think is happening. I think people should understand, and I think the deal will bear that out. I do think the U.S. is gonna be involved in this deal, and I do think the U.S. will give Ukraine a lot of security guarantees. But I think a lot of this for Trump is just like you said, it's a deal. Can you give me what I want? If not, you know, there's not a whole lot of support from my base back at home for continuing to fund this. And I think those things are coming up in these negotiations.
Mm.
So I don't agree with Trump on a lot of the positions he's taken, but I think that's where he's coming from.
Yeah. No, thank you for describing that. It's always a pleasure, Eric, to kind of sit down and get your take on the situation, because as we're kind of doing our divergent research here, I at least generally, not on every issue, but generally take that kind of progressive lens on a lot of this, and I feel like you bring a very, very valuable perspective to these discussions, as someone who does lean conservative on a lot of these issues, even if you don't agree with Trump on everything, certainly. There's kind of that lens and that continued familiarity with what's going on the right, the mentality there, and presenting that is in kind of a very charitable way that I think is fantastic. So
Thank you.
we're about out of time here. We're getting to 40 minutes. Obviously, there's so much more we could talk about with Ukraine. We could even sit here for 3 hours going into like DOGE, and
Hmm.
everything that's happening there, the whole Department of Justice debacle. We barely touched the Treasury. That's a big thing. But still, I think this was a very valuable discussion. So thank you very much.
Yep, very edifying as always, Sam. Thank you again.
All right, thanks everyone, and we will see you next week.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.